Feld 4.
Die Übertragung kommt durch. Verstanden.
Ich habe die Frequenz.
You were assigned to the camp at Dachau, then?
Yes, but only as a clerk. I know nothing of the atrocities.
April 1945. The air over central Germany is heavy with dust and smoke. Rail lines lie twisted. Roads are clogged with abandoned vehicles. The Reich is collapsing in plain sight. Inside a requisitioned municipal building, once a local administrative office, a small group of women stand in silence. Their posture is formal, practiced. Their uniforms are still intact. Pressed skirts, tailored jackets, insignia fixed carefully at the collar. For years, these symbols meant authority, belonging, purpose. Now, Allied officers move methodically down the line. No shouting, no spectacle, just clipped instructions delivered in measured tones. A table is placed near the wall. One by one, the women are instructed to step forward. Hands reach up. Badges are unclasped. Emblems bearing the eagle and swastika are removed and placed on a bare wood. The sound is faint, metal touching metal, but it echoes in the room. Some hesitate. Others comply immediately. No resistance follows. This is not a battlefield. There is no gunfire here. Yet for those standing in that room, this moment carries finality. Not simply the loss of a uniform, but the end of an identity built on power, obedience, and belief. And outside those walls, the same quiet ritual is unfolding across a defeated nation. The world that created these symbols is disappearing. From the earliest years of the Third Reich, the Nazi state understood the power of symbols. Uniforms, badges, armbands, and insignia were not decorative. They were tools, visual shortcuts that communicated authority, loyalty, and ideological alignment without a single word spoken. Women occupied a complex place within this system. Official Nazi doctrine promoted a rigid vision of womanhood. Kinder, Kusch, Kirche. Yet the demands of a total war state quickly outpaced ideology. By the late 1930s and accelerating after 1941, women were drawn into the machinery of the Reich in unprecedented numbers. They became auxiliaries, clerks, signal operators, administrators, guards, and logistical officers. Many were formally trained. Many wore uniforms. Many held rank-equivalent status within Nazi organizations, even if they were not frontline combatants. The Wehrmacht Helferinnen, the Luftwaffe auxiliaries, and female personnel attached to the SS administrative apparatus all operated within clearly defined hierarchies. Their uniforms varied by branch, but the message was consistent. The badge on the collar or breast signified more than employment. It signified ideological participation. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of women were serving the Reich in official capacities. Some operated radio equipment tracking Allied bombers. Some processed transport orders. Some managed prisoner records. Others worked directly inside concentration camps as guards or administrative staff. In each case, insignia mattered. The eagle, the wreath, the swastika, these were not optional. They marked inclusion within the state's moral universe. To wear them was to accept, at minimum, the authority they represented. To remove them was unthinkable while the regime remained intact. Nazi leadership reinforced this symbolism relentlessly. Training manuals emphasized appearance, discipline, and visual conformity. A uniform worn incorrectly was treated as a breach of order. A missing badge was a violation of duty. The system relied on external signals to maintain internal control. As the war turned against Germany, these women did not simply vanish from the structure. In fact, their importance often increased. As men were pulled to the front, Women filled administrative gaps. They became the connective tissue of a regime under strain, processing orders, maintaining records, transmitting information. Yet the closer the Reich moved toward collapse, the more fragile this authority became. By late 1944, Allied armies were advancing from both east and west. Cities were falling, command structures fractured, orders arrived late, or not at all. Still, uniforms were worn, badges were polished, ritual persisted, even as reality disintegrated around it. Because symbols endure longer than belief. For many female officers and auxiliaries, their identity had become inseparable from these visible markers. They were not civilians in their own minds. They belonged to something structured, disciplined, and powerful, until suddenly it no longer was. When Allied forces crossed into Germany in force, they did not encounter only soldiers. They encountered an entire administrative class still wearing the visual language of Nazism. And the Allies understood immediately what had to happen first. Not arrests, not trials, but disarmament of ideology, starting with the symbols that carried it. The quiet instructions heard in that municipal building in April 1945 were not improvised. They were part of a broader, deliberate approach unfolding across occupied territory. An approach rooted in the understanding that before a system could be dismantled legally, it had to be dismantled visually. And that process was only just beginning. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich no longer functioned as a coherent state. What remained was a patchwork of collapsing commands, isolated garrisons, and administrative offices continuing their routines out of habit rather than direction. Berlin was encircled. The Rhine had been crossed. The Luftwaffe was largely grounded. Rail networks were shattered by months of sustained bombing. Yet throughout Germany and occupied territories, thousands of women still reported to offices, communication centers, and logistical posts. Some did so because they believed the war could still be stabilized. Others continued simply because there was no clear instruction to stop. Allied planners anticipated this moment. Long before the first American, British, and Soviet troops entered German cities, occupation directives had been drafted. These orders were not only military, they were psychological. The objective was not just to defeat German forces, but to dismantle the ideological infrastructure that had sustained the Nazi state. Central to this effort was denazification. Denazification did not begin in courtrooms. It began on the street, in offices, and in processing centers. The first step was identification. The second was separation. The third was symbolic neutralization. Uniforms and insignia played a critical role in this process. Allied occupation forces were instructed to immediately prohibit the public display of Nazi symbols. Swastika armbands, collar tabs, breast eagles, and party pins were to be removed upon contact. This applied not only to male military personnel, but to all individuals serving in official Nazi capacities, including women. For female auxiliaries and officers, this moment often came without warning. In towns secured by Allied units, local administrative buildings were repurposed as processing points. Personnel were ordered to report for screening. In some cases, women arrived still wearing full uniforms. In others, they were already attempting to pass as civilians. The response was consistent. Badges were removed first. This was not an act of personal punishment. It was procedural. Allied reports described the practice in neutral language: removal of insignia, confiscation of symbols, neutralization of ideological identifiers. But for those on the receiving end, the experience was deeply personal. The badge represented status within a rigid hierarchy. It marked belonging to a system that had promised order and purpose. Its removal was not accompanied by speeches or explanations. There was no negotiation. The authority that once enforced obedience now demanded compliance from the other side of the table. For many women, this was the first moment they fully grasped that the Reich was not merely losing, it was gone. The collapse of command structures accelerated this realization. Orders from Berlin had ceased. Superiors were missing, captured, or dead. Pay stopped. Rations dwindled. What remained was the uniform. And now, even though it was being stripped away, Allied forces documented these encounters carefully. Reports note that female personnel generally complied without resistance. Instances of defiance were rare and quickly resolved. The system they had served had conditioned obedience too thoroughly for spontaneous rebellion. Yet the psychological impact was unmistakable. Without insignia, rank dissolved. A Luftwaffe signals auxiliary became an unclassified civilian. An SS administrative officer became a detainee. Authority was reduced to paperwork and memory. This process unfolded across occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, each with variations in tone and enforcement, but unified in purpose. The goal was not humiliation for its own sake. It was erasure of legitimacy. Once symbols were removed, individuals could be sorted, questioned, detained, or released. Without them, the myth of Nazi permanence collapsed faster than any bombed building. By early May 1945, this ritual had become routine, quiet, efficient, unremarkable to the men enforcing it. But for the women standing in those lines, it marked the moment when belief, identity, and power fell away, leaving only uncertainty in their place. And from this point forward, the story was no longer about uniforms. It was about accountability, perception, and memory. For the women who stood in Allied processing rooms in the final months of the war, the removal of Nazi insignia was not experienced as an abstract policy. It was experienced as a personal rupture. Many of these women had entered service young. Some were still teenagers when they first put on a uniform. Training had emphasized discipline, loyalty, and emotional restraint. Individual identity was secondary to function. Over time, posture, language, and self-perception aligned with the role. The badge became part of that alignment, to where it was to be seen, to be addressed correctly, to be acknowledged as someone with purpose. Its removal did not just end a job. It dissolved a carefully constructed sense of self. This was the human angle of denazification, sudden dislocation. Allied observers frequently noted emotional responses ranging from visible shock to controlled silence. There were few recorded outbursts. Most reactions were inward. Women complied, stepped back, and waited. Years of conditioning did not vanish in a single moment. It simply had nowhere left to attach itself. The ideological angle ran deeper. Nazism relied heavily on visible belonging. The state's authority was reinforced through constant visual reinforcement. Uniforms in streets, offices, rail stations, and factories. To remove insignia was to break the illusion that the ideology still governed space. For women, this break carried additional weight. They'd serve a regime that simultaneously limited and empowered them. Official rhetoric framed them as supporters of male authority. Yet wartime necessity elevated them into positions of operational importance. This contradiction was never resolved inside the system, but it was exposed brutally when the system collapsed. Once the badge was gone, there was no ideological shield left. No symbolic justification for actions taken under its authority. This is where the gender dimension became unavoidable. In post-war narratives, female participation in Nazi structures was often minimized or reframed. Many women would later describe themselves as secretaries, helpers, or apolitical workers. In some cases, this was accurate. In others, it obscured real responsibility. The moment of insignia removal confronted this ambiguity head-on. Allied forces did not differentiate based on gender when it came to symbols. A badge was a badge. An eagle was an eagle. The authority it represented did not change based on who wore it. Yet the psychological impact differed. Male officers often experienced removal as military defeat. Female officers more frequently experienced it as social exposure. Without the uniform, they were no longer shielded by role or rank. They were visible as individuals, subject to scrutiny without institutional backing. This created a tension that would persist long after the war. Some women felt genuine humiliation, not because they believed the ideology was just, but because they had internalized the idea that obedience equaled virtue. The removal of symbols felt like a public declaration that obedience itself was now suspect. Others felt anger, confusion, or disbelief. The system they had trusted to define right and wrong had vanished without explanation. The act itself remained restrained. Allied personnel were instructed to avoid unnecessary spectacle. There were no public shaming rituals, no forced marches. The humiliation, when it occurred, emerged from contrast, what had been and what now was. A woman who had once issued orders now waited silently. A uniform that once commanded deference now meant detention. The power reversal was absolute. This angle reveals why the removal of insignia mattered far beyond bureaucracy. It was a psychological severing, a clean break between past authority and present accountability. And as this process repeated itself across thousands of encounters, patterns emerged. Some women adapted quickly, shifting into survival mode. Others clung to denial. A few attempted to conceal affiliation altogether. All of these responses would shape what came next, how denazification unfolded, how responsibility was assigned, and how memory would later be constructed. Because once symbols were gone, questions could no longer be avoided. Who had done what? And under whose authority? Those questions would define the next phase of the story. From the Allied perspective, the removal of Nazi insignia was neither emotional nor symbolic in intent. It was operational. Occupation troops had been trained to recognize that the Third Reich did not collapse solely through military defeat. It collapsed because its structures, administrative, ideological, and psychological, were systematically dismantled. Symbols were part of that structure. Leaving them intact risked preserving the illusion of continuity. Allied officers encountering female Nazi personnel did not see women first. They saw functionaries of a defeated regime. Reports from American and British units describe these encounters in neutral language, focused on classification and processing rather than judgment. Rank was noted. Unit affiliation was recorded. Insignia was confiscated. The absence of spectacle was intentional. There were no speeches about guilt, no public accusations. The goal was control, not confrontation. By reducing individuals to their documented roles, rather than their displayed authority, the occupation forces neutralized potential resistance before it could form. This approach reflected a broader enemy perspective shaped by experience. Allied forces had learned, often painfully, that Nazi loyalty did not always disappear with surrender. In some regions, underground networks persisted. In others, former officials attempted to blend into civilian populations while maintaining influence. Symbols mattered because they signaled allegiance, and allegiance mattered because it shaped post-war stability. Removing insignia from women was therefore a preventative measure. It eliminated ambiguity. A person without a badge could be questioned. A person with one could inspire obedience. The moral dimension of this process was more complex. Many Allied soldiers struggled internally with what they were witnessing. Some had liberated camps only days earlier. Others had lost friends in combat against units whose paperwork these women had processed. Yet occupation protocols required restraint. Justice was to be institutional, not improvised. This created a moral tension. On one hand, some women genuinely had minimal decision-making power. They followed orders. They filled roles created by a system they did not design. On the other hand, obedience had sustained that system. Paperwork enabled deportations. Communications facilitated operations. Administration made mass violence efficient. The badge symbolized participation, not necessarily intent. Allied authorities understood this distinction, which is why removal of insignia was not itself a verdict. It was a reset. Only after symbols were gone could individual responsibility be evaluated. For the women involved, this uncertainty was deeply destabilizing. Psychologically, the transition from authority to ambiguity was abrupt. Many had lived inside a framework that defined right and wrong externally. Orders came from above. Compliance was rewarded. Doubt was discouraged. When that framework vanished, it left behind a vacuum. Interrogation reports and later testimonies reveal recurring patterns. Some women insisted they had never believed in the ideology, even while acknowledging years of service. Others clung to technical definitions, secretary, operator, clerk, as moral shields. A smaller number expressed confusion rather than denial, struggling to reconcile their actions with the reality now confronting them. The removal of insignia intensified this reckoning. Without symbols, there was no role to retreat into. There is only the individual, separated from a system that had once absorbed responsibility on her behalf. This psychological exposure was not accidental. Denazification was designed to force confrontation with personal agency. The question was no longer what uniform did you wear, but what did you do while wearing it? For some, this led to cooperation and reflection. For others, it triggered withdrawal, resentment, or silence that would last decades. Memory became selective. Language softened. Responsibility blurred. Yet the Allied approach remained consistent. No badge, no public authority, no ideological legitimacy. Only then could trials, releases, or reintegration proceed. By the end of 1945, the visible presence of Nazi symbols had nearly vanished from occupied Germany. Streets, offices, and institutions no longer carried the visual language of the Reich. What remained was invisible, and therefore harder to confront. The real work was still ahead, because removing a symbol is simple. Understanding what it once allowed people to do is not. And that understanding would reach its most intense point when accountability shifted from procedure to consequence. The decisive turning point did not arrive with gunfire or explosions. It arrived quietly, carried out in offices, schools, barracks, and town halls across a defeated country. By May 1945, Germany was no longer fighting. It was being processed. In Allied occupation zones, standardized procedures replaced improvisation. Temporary holding centers were established. Screening forms were printed and distributed. Military police units were trained to recognize insignia, ranks, and organizational markers associated with the Nazi state. For female officers and auxiliaries, this phase marked the moment when ambiguity disappeared. Previously, some had believed their gender might shield them. Others assumed administrative roles would be overlooked in the chaos of defeat. Those assumptions collapsed as systematically as the Reich itself. Allied orders were explicit. Any individual who had served in an official Nazi capacity, regardless of gender, was to be identified, disarmed of symbols, and categorized. This included women from the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, Luftwaffe communications units, SS administrative offices, and camp-related personnel. The process followed a predictable rhythm. Names were called, documents were checked, uniforms were inspected. Then came the instruction: remove the badge. In many locations, this occurred in silence. Allied personnel avoided commentary. There was no need to explain what was already obvious. The authority that badge represented no longer existed. For the women involved, this moment carried finality. Once insignia was removed, ranks ceased to matter. A woman who had overseen staff now stood equal to those she once supervised. A communications officer who had relayed operational data now waited for questioning like any other detainee. The psychological shift was immediate. Accounts describe women staring at the table where badges were placed, as if the object itself still held meaning. Others avoided looking at it altogether. Some adjusted their clothing unconsciously, as though the absence could be corrected. It could not. This was the true climax of the denazification process. Not trials, not verdicts, but the erasure of visible authority. Without symbols, power could not be performed. Without performance, belief faltered. Allied documentation notes that resistance during this phase was minimal. The system that once enforced obedience had trained its servants too well. Compliance persisted even after legitimacy vanished. In Soviet-occupied areas, the process was often harsher, faster, and accompanied by immediate detention. In Western zones, procedures tended to be more methodical, with an emphasis on classification before incarceration. Yet across all zones, the removal of insignia remained constant. It was the dividing line. Before removal, there was still pretense. After removal, there was only reality. For many women, this moment was accompanied by an unspoken realization. Whatever protection the regime had promised was gone. There would be no collective shield, no ideological defense. Responsibility would be assessed individually. This realization altered behavior instantly. Some became cooperative, hoping transparency would lead to leniency. Others retreated into silence. A few attempted to minimize involvement, redefining years of service in softer terms. The badge, once a symbol of belonging, now represented danger. Its absence was a necessary step toward survival. As Allied processing continued, piles of confiscated insignia grew. Stored in boxes, cataloged, or destroyed, they became artifacts rather than authority. Objects stripped of meaning. But for the women who had worn them, the meaning lingered. Because while a badge can be removed in seconds, identity does not dissolve so easily. The turning point had passed. The Reich's symbols were gone. What remained was the far more difficult question of consequence. And that question would define the next stage of the story. Once the initial phase of processing was complete, the removal of insignia ceased to be a moment and became a system. Across occupied Germany and Austria, Allied commands standardized the procedure. Orders were circulated. Posters were displayed. Civilians were warned that the public display of Nazi symbols was prohibited. Compliance was no longer requested. It was enforced. For female former officers and auxiliaries, this shift had immediate consequences. Those identified as having served in significant administrative or organizational roles were detained for further screening. Others were issued temporary documentation, classifying them as civilians under occupation authority. In both cases, the badge was gone, and with it any claim to institutional identity. The transition was abrupt. One day, a woman might still be reporting to a familiar office, surrounded by files and routines. The next, she was standing in a line, holding paperwork that reduced her life structure to a series of checkboxes. Name, date of birth, affiliation, period of service. Allied interrogators focused on function rather than belief. Questions were factual. What office did you work in? Who were your superiors? What type of documents did you process? Where you stationed? For many women, these questions forced an internal reckoning. Administrative work that had once felt distant from violence now appeared in a different light. Transport lists, personnel rosters, communication logs. Seemingly mundane tasks were now recognized as links in a larger chain. The badge had masked this connection. Without it, the work stood exposed. Immediate consequences varied by zone and role. In the Western zones, many women were released after preliminary screening, especially those whose roles were assessed as low-level. Others were held for months, pending denazification tribunals. A smaller number, particularly those connected to camps or SS offices, were transferred to long-term detention. In Soviet-controlled areas, outcomes were often harsher. Detention could be immediate and prolonged. Some women disappeared into the post-war camp system, their fate recorded only in fragmentary documents. Across all zones, however, the psychological consequence was consistent. Uncertainty replaced structure. The future was no longer defined by rank or assignment. It was defined by decisions made by strangers, based on records that could not be undone. For Allied authorities, this phase represented success. Nazi symbols had vanished from public life. The regime's visual presence was erased. Compliance had been achieved without widespread unrest. But beneath the surface, the effects were still unfolding. Former female officers returned to communities where silence was often safer than truth. Many concealed their service. Uniforms were destroyed or hidden. Insignia disappeared into drawers, rivers, or rubble. Memory became selective. Some women would later describe themselves as victims of circumstance. Others emphasized youth or coercion. A few acknowledged belief and responsibility. Most avoided the subject altogether. The badge's removal marked the end of one identity, but it did not automatically produce a new one. This gap would shape post-war German society in subtle ways. The absence of visible symbols made it easier to move forward without fully confronting the past. Authority had been dismantled, but understanding lagged behind. By late 1945, the world had shifted its focus. Reconstruction began. Political priorities changed. The visible rituals of denazification slowed, even as their consequences continued to ripple outward. For the women who had once stood in uniform, the moment of insignia removal remained fixed in memory, an instant when power vanished and ambiguity took its place. The climax had passed. What followed was quieter, longer, and more complicated, and it would define not only individual lives, but how history itself would remember them. With the visible dismantling of Nazi authority complete, the occupation entered a new phase, one governed not by symbols, but by classification and judgment. Denazification moved from processing rooms into courtrooms, tribunals, and administrative panels. Across the Allied zones, millions of Germans were assessed under systems designed to measure responsibility. For women who had served as officers, auxiliaries, or administrators, this process was uneven, complex, and often deeply personal. The legal framework varied by occupying power, but the underlying logic remained consistent. Individuals were categorized. Major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated persons. For most female personnel, placement depended not on ideology, but on function. Documentation mattered. Witness statements mattered. Gaps in records mattered. The earlier removal of insignia now proved critical. Without visible rank, women were assessed on paper alone. This benefited some and disadvantaged others. Those whose work left minimal trace, clerical duties, communication support, local administration, were often classified as followers. Many were released after brief detention, sometimes with restrictions on employment. Others faced fines or mandatory participation in re-education programs. For women connected to SS offices or camp administration, outcomes were far more severe. Investigations uncovered involvement in record-keeping, personnel supervision, and logistical support directly tied to mass imprisonment and death. Some were prosecuted. Others were held for years without trial, particularly in Soviet zones. Social consequences followed swiftly. In communities struggling to rebuild, former female officers often encountered suspicion rather than sympathy. Their uniforms were gone, but memories remained. Neighbors knew who had worn what. Silence became a survival strategy. Many women altered biographies. Employment histories were shortened. Service years were described vaguely. Marriage records and name changes provided cover for reinvention. The removal of insignia had made this possible. Without symbols to provoke confrontation, reintegration could proceed quietly. This suited both individuals and communities eager to move forward. Yet the absence of symbols also complicated accountability. Denazification tribunals were overwhelmed. Files were incomplete. Political priorities shifted as Cold War tensions emerged. By the late 1940s, enforcement softened. Amnesties expanded. The urgency of reckoning diminished. For many women, this meant legal closure without moral resolution. They were free, but unsettled. The badge they had once worn was gone, yet its absence continued to shape their lives. Authority had evaporated, but memory persisted in fragments, silences, and unease. This tension between legal outcome and personal reckoning would define the long-term aftermath. Justice had been administered, imperfectly, unevenly, but the deeper question of responsibility remained unresolved. And it would surface again, not in courtrooms, but in history itself. As the years passed, the physical traces of Nazism faded faster than the memories attached to them. Buildings were rebuilt. Offices reopened under new authorities. Uniforms disappeared from public view. For many former female officers and auxiliaries, life resumed in outwardly ordinary ways: employment, marriage, family. The war receded into the background of daily survival. Yet the silence surrounding their service was rarely accidental. In post-war Germany and Austria, collective memory formed unevenly. Public narratives focused on destruction, suffering, and reconstruction. Male military defeat was acknowledged. Civilian hardship was emphasized. Female participation in Nazi structures, particularly in administrative roles, remained largely unspoken. The removal of insignia in 1945 had enabled this quiet transition. Without visible symbols to provoke questions, many women were able to re-enter society without confrontation. The badge that once identified them had been taken away, and with it, the immediate need to explain who they had been. This absence shaped historical understanding for decades. Early post-war scholarship and public discourse often portrayed women primarily as victims of the regime rather than participants within it. While many were indeed constrained by social and legal structures, this framing obscured the reality that thousands had held real responsibility inside the Nazi system. Archives told a different story. Personnel files, transport records, and administrative correspondence preserved evidence of female involvement in communications, logistics, camp administration, and policy execution. Over time, historians began to reassess these roles, not to equate them with frontline violence, but to recognize their function within a totalitarian system. This reassessment was slow. For many women, the psychological impact of insignia removal lingered in subtle ways. Interviews conducted decades later reveal recurring themes: avoidance, minimization, and moral distancing. Some insisted they had merely followed rules. Others emphasized youth, fear, or lack of alternatives. A smaller number acknowledged belief and later regret. The badge had once absorbed responsibility. Its absence forced responsibility inward. Societal silence reinforced this process. Families rarely asked. Communities preferred not to remember. National identity focused on renewal rather than reflection. The Cold War further complicated matters, shifting attention away from denazification toward geopolitical alignment. By the time public reckoning resumed in earnest through later trials, memorialization efforts, and academic study, many of the women involved were elderly or deceased. What remained were records, and a recurring image preserved in photographs and reports. Women standing without insignia, authority removed, identity suspended. That image came to symbolize something larger than individual guilt or innocence. It represented the collapse of a system that had relied on ordinary people to function, and the uncomfortable truth that participation often looked mundane rather than monstrous. The long-term aftermath of insignia removal was not justice alone. It was ambiguity, a society rebuilding itself on foundations that were never fully examined. individuals moving forward without fully reconciling who they had been. History eventually would return to these moments, not to humiliate, but to understand. Because the removal of a badge is not the end of story. It is the point at which a society must decide whether it will remember honestly or conveniently. And that decision continues to shape how the past is understood. In the end, the removal of Nazi insignia was not about fabric, metal, or ceremony. It was about severing the visible link between power and belief. For the women who stood silently as badges were taken from their uniforms, the moment marked a boundary between two worlds. One had promised order, purpose, and belonging through obedience. The other offered only uncertainty, accountability, and the burden of individual memory. History often records the fall of regimes through dates and battles. But systems truly collapse when their symbols lose meaning. When an emblem no longer commands obedience. When authority no longer speaks through uniform and posture. In those quiet rooms of 1945, that collapse became tangible. The Allied forces understood this instinctively. By removing insignia first, they dismantled the performance of power before addressing its consequences. Without symbols, ideology could no longer disguise itself as routine. Without uniform, responsibility could no longer be deferred upward. For many women, this was the first moment they were forced to confront the distance between role and self. Some would later deny belief. Others would claim coercion. A few would acknowledge participation. But all passed through the same threshold. The moment when identity, once worn openly, was stripped away. The absence that followed proved enduring. It allowed reinvention. It allowed silence. It allowed societies to rebuild without fully looking back. Yet history does look back. In archives, testimonies, and photographs, the image remains. Women standing without insignia, authority gone, futures undecided. Not villains in caricature, not heroes in defeat, but participants in a system that depended on ordinary compliance to function. The lesson of that moment is not humiliation. It is responsibility. Symbols can grant power quickly. They can also dissolve just as fast. What endures is what individuals choose to do while wearing them, and how honestly they confront that choice once the symbols are gone. In that sense, the quiet act of removing a badge in 1945 was not merely an ending. It was the beginning of a reckoning that continues, wherever power hides behind symbols and obedience replaces judgment.